Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous people and nations have stewarded through generations the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Julien Lee is the 2022-2023 Sophie Seiler Rare Materials resident in the Department of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Yale Center for British Art. The Nadia Sophie Seiler Rare Books Residency is a 9-month term-limited position that provides library professionals with substantive exposure to rare materials cataloging. The residency is made possible by the Seiler Memorial Fund in memory of Nadia Sophie Seiler's passion for books and libraries, with the goal of encouraging similar enthusiasm and expertise in the next generation of special collections librarians. Julien will discuss a few cataloging conundrums he investigated during his 9-month residency. While he has cataloged many objects, he has chosen some of particular interest: a series of Bewick printing blocks, a hand-colored panorama of the Rhine, and a 1520 edition of the Chronicles of England. Julien.
Hi, Linda, thank you for the introduction. Again, this is made possible through the Nadia Sophie Seiler Rare Materials Residency. I'm very grateful for the opportunities that I've had here. And as Linda mentioned, today I'll be focusing on 3 objects or sets of objects because I found them particularly difficult and interesting to work through during this residency. I also wanted to note that these generally took far beyond the average time in research that I would usually spend on an individual object. I thought they'd be interesting to talk about. And all of them are also from the Paul Mellon collection here at the Yale Center for British Art. So the first object that I wanted to talk about was the Chronicles of England, which you can currently see here. And when I first picked up this book, there were 2 central questions that jumped out at me. And so to explain how I got to these questions, I'm going to show a few pages from this monograph on the next slide. Okay, so here you can see 2 pages that at first appear to be title pages. So the page on the left is the initial page of the book, and then the page on the right appears about 4/5 of the way through. So just for convenience for this presentation, I'll be referring to the first section as the Chronicles, and then the second part as a description. As you can see, the one at the top, the one on the left says the Chronicles of England, and then the right says description of England. It's also important to note that each of them has their own imprint and printer's mark. And then the next slide I will show. So here is again the same image is on the left. Once again, this is the verso or the recto of the first leaf, and then on the right you have the verso of this first leaf, which begins the tabula or table. And so there were 2 kind of initial large questions that jumped out at me here. So the first is whether this is a bound with, as we refer to in rare materials cataloging. And the second, I had a question about the initial page or the initial leaf. And so first I want to go through what is a bound with. So a couple of definitions. It tends to be used in a pragmatic type of way. So one definition from the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Illinois says, the traditional purpose of a bound with is to represent a single physical object that contains 2 or more distinct works. Frequently, this approach would be utilized when the works were not published or collected under a common collective title. And then below, you can see the Yale University Library's bound with procedures, describing several bibliographic records representing individual titles that physically exist in a single unit. These titles have been brought together either locally or by a publisher. And so to go back to these 2 parts, one question that I had was, were these issued together or were they issued separately or published separately and then later came together? And so for those of you who have very sharp eyes, you may see one potential answer to this question already, which is that the page on the left describes at the top the Chronicles of England with the deeds of popes and emperors, and also the description of England. And so at first it may seem like they were issued together because it's referencing the second part, the description of England. However, because I was able to access a reference source that discusses the Yale Center for British Arts copy in particular, the first page is actually a facsimile title page, or a facsimile page. And so this facsimile page is not the original initial leaf of this work. It is actually a combination of different aspects from other editions that the facsimilist John Harris decided to use. And so this brought up quite a number of questions. You can see then my first question became, well, what does the initial page look like? Because this would be very important for determining what to title the record. And then it also brings up the question, well, were they issued together? Is this a bound with or is it not a bound with? Yes, and so the source for this information on our copy in particular comes from a publication of the Grolier Club, 55 books printed before 1525, representing the works of England's first printers, an exhibition from the collection of Paul Mellon. And so this monograph obviously came to the Yale Center for British Art later after this exhibition. So next, I wanted to find some more information about the 1520 edition of the Chronicles of England. So I undertook some research here. So one thing that these are different places that I looked. So the first was English Short Title Catalog, where I looked at which institutions may hold a copy of this 1520 edition in particular. Through that, I was able to access a few digitized copies online. I also went to the Beinecke Reading Room, as the Beinecke Library also has a copy of this edition. And there were some things that I found that congregated around certain facts, or I should say certain facts kind of came out to me. So first was that none of these copies that I looked at had the original initial page. None of them had a facsimile either. And then many of them were also lacking the table or the table of contents. And then also most copies had the order swapped. So the description was often bound first and then the chronicles second. So after discovering all of this, I went back to the Grolier Club description of the Yale Center for British Arts copy, which does note the woodcut that appears on the original title page of the 1520 Chronicles, parentheses, All Souls copy, is a version found frequently, etc. But the important part is that it mentions an All Souls copy, which is one that was not digitized online, so I couldn't access it right away. But I thought, well, I'm really interested in finding out what the original initial leaf looked like. So I reached out to All Souls College at Oxford, and they were extremely helpful and sent me a few pictures of what their copy looks like. So here on the left, we can see the original leaf. This is 2A1, and this actually lacks the collective title that we had seen on the Yale Center for British Arts facsimile title page, which I've repeated on the right here. So you can, yes, and so this is the facsimile on the right. So, and this may possibly be the only existing original leaf. So this answers a question about the initial page, which is that no, as you can see, it does not have a title written or printed at the top. However, then it kind of became a question, because there is that lack of title at the top, were these two sections intended to be, or were they issued together? And so the answer to this turns out to be within the book itself. So on the last page of the tables, here shown on the left, you can see it says at the bottom, the description of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland in the latest end of these present chronicles, thus endeth the table. And so this confirms both that the chronicles comes first and the description comes second, and that they were intended to be issued together. And so on the right, here I have two 500 fields which show up in our catalog as notes in the record, repeating this text as well as its source, and then another 500 indicating that the description is included within this larger work, which could be called the Chronicles of England. I also have briefly here, these correspond to the 245 and 246 fields, which if I have time at the end, I'll come back to just go over briefly. Okay, so next I wanted to show some of the Thomas Bewick blocks that I worked on cataloging while I was here. All of these were original cataloging. So first, just to show some images, just to get an idea, this is the rhinoceros. Here is another block. These images were taken by the center's photographer, Richard, who did a really amazing job photographing them to bring out all of the different intricacies. And so each of these blocks, here what was interesting when I first saw them is that on the back of the blocks, each one has a handwritten label that says something like volume 4, page 209, or volume 3, page 61, and so on. And so after doing a bit of research, I found that these volume and page numbers, with the exception of one block, correspond to the 5 volumes of the memorial edition of Thomas Bewick's works. However, as you can see, this memorial edition was published long after Bewick's death, so it wasn't helpful necessarily for determining dates to include in the record. So I did some more digging, and one resource that I used extensively was the works of Thomas Bewick, various editions. So I started looking back on, for example, Quadruped's book, his birds books, to see which editions had the prints of these blocks. This meant that the page and volume numbers no longer corresponded. In most cases, I could find the blocks by name. So for example, rhinoceros was pretty easy to find in earlier editions of Quadrupeds, but in a few cases, the blocks actually appeared in different places in the memorial edition than in the earliest editions that I at least could find. So one, for example, that appeared under the bird known as the black guillemot appeared in under the bird known as the kittiwake in an earlier edition. However, it helped with identifying at least dates after which the block could not have been produced. As an example, just because I think it's very visually interesting, this block, I have supplied the title Jupiter and the Herdsman. And then on the next slide, you can see what this looks like when it was printed in the book. So this is part of Thomas Bewick's Fables. And so it seemed appropriate to title the block similarly to this section. However, I mentioned one exception, and that is this block. This block was not labeled with a volume number. Instead, it said Goldsmith's History of England on the back. So obviously, I tried to look for a print of this block in different editions of Goldsmith's History of England. The first edition that I found, this is clearly not the same, this imprint was clearly, or this was clearly not caused by the printing block that we have here at the center. I tried a couple of other editions as well, all of those that included kind of extra content or earlier editions. So I tried 1854 edition, and then the closest one is probably the 1795 edition, which includes With Heads by Bewick in the title. And this is the image to the right of King Richard II that appears in this book by Bewick. It's very close. I will go back and show this image again, but it's not quite the same image. So this I also found to be very perplexing. In an effort to try to locate this block, I tried a few other places. So one was, again, Bewick's Fables of Aesop. So I paged through the entire book looking for that, mostly because there is an essay in the book by Goldsmith. So I wondered if perhaps someone had written Goldsmith's History of England, but it was in fact a different collaboration between Goldsmith and Bewick. I also tried looking in Robert Dodsley's Chronicle of the Kings of England. And this is because it actually also has engravings by Bewick, but they also don't correspond to the printing block that we have in our collection. And then finally, I also looked at a compendious history of England from the invasion of the Romans to the war with France. And this one was interesting because there are cuts by John Bewick, not Thomas, but also not the same as the printing block. So in the end, this remains somewhat of a mystery, and I'll show you what I did with the catalog record. Because the depiction on the block is very similar to the images that we saw previously, including the one known to be by Bewick, and it's very similar to other depictions of King Richard II. Here is what I have in the catalog record, and these correspond to the 500. So what I have is, the image on this block could not be matched to known Bewick engravings of King Richard II, such as those that appear in Goldsmith's History of England or in Dodsley's Chronicle of the Kings of England. However, the image is similar to Bewick's and other portrayals of Richard II, and the block's provenance is as part of a collection of Bewick blocks at the Yale Center for British Art. And then I also put a note, which is in all of these all of the records for each individual block, title devised by cataloger. You know, one day perhaps the image may be identified or conclusively disidentified with Bewick. And that's something that I find very interesting about cataloging, is that it's not a static record. If someday more information comes to light or a researcher decides to delve really deeply into this subject, the record can be updated very easily. Okay, and then finally, I have the panorama of the Rhine. And this one, here I've put part of the 300 fields, and I'll show some more images just to first get a sense of what this is. So what is pictured here is the what it looks like from the outside, so the covers, as well as the printed title label. And then next, this is what happens when you open up this booklet. And it did arrive to us with this sheet kind of torn off. And then next, seen from very far away, because it's on the PowerPoint, but this is kind of what it looks like when it is all unfolded. And again, thanks to Richard for photographing this. And then here you can see the kind of a close-up on the panorama to get a sense of what it would look like. So there are different names of places up and down the sides. And so this is kind of a different type of cataloging conundrum than the other two that I talked about. It's in some ways both more theoretical and then more practical. So the question that came up for me when cataloging this was whether to catalog it as a cartographic object or as a graphic object. And so this would mean, was I going to catalog it according to descriptive catalogs of rare materials graphics, DCRMG, or descriptive cataloging of rare materials cartographic, DCRMC. Both of these being published by the Rare Books and Manuscripts section of the Association of College and Research Libraries. So first, there are a few, this type of object is explicitly addressed in DCRMC or cartographic. So one section that's mentioned is mentioned under views, panoramas, panoramic drawing, perspective view, and then as well in the glossary, perspective representation of the landscape in which the detail is shown as if projected onto a vertical plane or onto the inside of a cylinder centered vertically on the observer. See also perspective view or view. And so through looking at this object and discussing it with Francis Lapka, the senior catalog librarian here in Rare Books and Manuscripts at the center, it would be perfectly valid to catalog it as cartographic material. There's also a provision, or I guess a statement in descriptive cataloging of rare materials cartographic that describes the institution's mission and user needs as well, though. So this states, evaluate the relevance of the items awaiting cataloging to the institution's mission and the needs of its users. Ideally, the institution will have developed internal documentation that will facilitate such an evaluation, including a mission statement, collection development guidelines, and a listing of constituent users and their anticipated needs. The needs of both patrons, researchers, teachers, students, and staff, collection development, reference, technical services, etc., should be taken into consideration. So there were a couple of ideas that I considered with this object. One was simply precedent. So how had similar objects or panoramas been cataloged here at the center or at other institutions? And so here at the center, there were a few panoramas, none of them exactly the same or the same type as the one that I was looking at. Many had been cataloged according to DCRMG or graphics. And so one question that also came to me was, how is the object presenting itself and how is it presenting itself to, potential users, guests, researchers, or even internally to staff? How would people be searching? Would they, upon seeing this, think of it as cartographic or as graphic arts? And so I also thought it would be wise then to speak with colleagues who are interacting directly with these users every day or facilitating requests for how our users are accessing and interpreting objects. So I spoke with, I spoke with basically my colleagues in Rare Books and Manuscripts. So Francis, I also solicited the advice and thoughts of Laura and Catherine, senior curatorial assistants here at the Department of Rare Books and Manuscripts, to get a sense for how, from the users, the researchers that they interact with, how would they expect people to try to search for an object like this? If the end goal is that they would like to view the object, use it in their research, or even just access the online catalog record. And what I heard back was that for the most part, it seemed more useful to the object and to our users to catalog it as graphics material, so DCRMG, which is the conclusion of this mystery. So a bit theoretical and then also a bit practical at the same time. Also, I should mention, I still preserved descriptions of the cartographic content in the record, just without the coordinates and other information that you'd expect to see in a DCRMC record. So there are some keywords in there that if someone were searching for a map of the Rhine, this would also come up in our catalog. Okay, and that's the end. Thank you again to all of Rare Books and Manuscripts, especially Francis Lapka, Laura and Catherine, RBM, to my colleagues at the Yale Center for British Art, at Yale University Libraries, and to everyone who has supported me and who I've worked with in the past, many of whom I know are attending.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was extraordinarily insightful, and I have some questions if you're up for it and ready. Okay. One question says, can you say more about the title and additional titles for the Chronicles of England?
Yes, let me go back to this slide. Okay. Yes, thank you. I was hoping to talk about this because I knew that I was running a little long on time. So here, these are corresponding to the 245 and 246 fields in this record for the Chronicles of England and the description of England. So first, the title is taken from the colophon as an appropriate representative title, as it's, I believe, the only passage that specifically references Chronicle of England. There are additional or variant titles displayed next, as well as the source from which they come. And so first is the title from the tables that we saw so many times. This is the verso of the first leaf, and it does appear on the All Souls copy as well. It starts, "Here beginneth the short and brood table," and standing for brief. And this is the title under which many or most other copies are also cataloged. And then there is also a title from the prologue, which appears a few pages or the page after the table ends. And this is because quite a few copies are also missing the entire tabula. And so the opening words that would be seen are as such. There is the title of the second section, which is Description of England. And then finally, an additional title for searching directly on Chronicle of England. There's also a uniform title because Chronicles of England, had quite a few different editions and different variants, which I learned from consulting the Madison book, The Prose Brew, which was really helpful as well. As well as a 700 that includes the uniform title for the description of England. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Did you choose your own projects when you came, or were they assigned to you? And if you got to choose your own, how did you decide?
Yeah, that's a great question. So somewhat decided and somewhat I got to choose. So when I was applying for the residency, there were kind of three areas. So one was printed monographs, but particularly color plate books from the Abbey collection, which I didn't talk about today, but I did catalog a significant number of. Another was cartographic material, including early printed maps and atlases, which I also didn't really talk about today, but I worked on quite a bit. And the third was manuscript material. So for me, I had a little bit of experience working with cartographic materials, and I really enjoyed that a lot. So I really was hoping for that as one of my areas. And then also, I think I really wanted to gain experience working on rare monographs as well, or books. And so since out of those three areas, I could essentially choose two, since as a 9-month residency, wanted to make sure that I could go deeply into all of those. Yeah, so to some extent, yes. And then I'm fortunate that there are an endless number of interesting objects here, such as the blocks, which fall into none of those categories. But Francis, again, who's my supervisor here, offered those to me as an opportunity.
Thank you. We're going to squeeze one more in. On the block not positively associated with Bewick, you said something was written on the back, written by hand. How does that compare with the other blocks that contain volume and page numbers?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So on the back of the King Richard block, it says Goldsmith History of England. verbatim, that's what it says. And then on the other ones, yeah, they all say BOL period, and usually Roman numerals for the volume, and then P period, and the number of the page. One thing that's a very interesting question. I think it's possible that it could be possible that on the back of the King Richard block, the handwriting is in uppercase, while I think it's similar to title case on the other blocks. As for being in the same hand, I would definitely need to look at them again. I'm not sure that any of the capital letters on the volume blocks, B, it would just be V. I don't think that appears, so it might be difficult to compare, but that makes me want to do that after this. So yeah, I'm curious if there are any thoughts on that too. Feel free to, if we don't have time today, reach out.
Thank you very much. And thank you to our guests who tuned in today. Please check our website for our next Art and Context. And Julian, thank you so very much for such an informative talk.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your time.